and good afternoon or the very end of good morning for those who are joining us now and entering into this session. You've come to the right place. This is the ISACA South Florida webinar that we'll be talking about cybersecurity audits, what we learned in 2020, the remote work environment. And obviously there's quite a bit that we learned whether we wanted to or not, right? So this is going to be a great session that we're very excited to bring to you today. And on my time, I have just about 3 minutes before noon. So we're allowing people to filter into the session right now. We're always aware that there are people who are kind of managing their schedule, which appears to be busier than ever now that we're all working remote and doing all kinds of video conferences and meetings throughout the day. And so we know that even in the first 5 to 10 minutes, there's sometimes people still joining, and that's just fine. But what we want to do is allow those people who are here right for the beginning, we want to allow them to be ready to go more or less at noon, so that I can make a couple of, as is typical, a couple of very brief general announcements, and then we'll be ready to get on to the main event. And and there's a comment from Abby. Happy New Year, everyone. So Happy New Year to you as well, Abby, and Happy New Year to everyone, all of you who are joining us today. We're thrilled to have you here for what is going to be a fantastic conversation. We're very, very excited about this. Consider it to be a great opportunity, and very grateful that Lynn is able to join us for today, because this is a very important topic, and we're looking forward to hearing this conversation very much. And I hope that wherever you are joining us from, that everyone on your end is in good health. And I hope that with some good fortune and some good planning, that some point in the near future we'll be reconvening in person for these types of events. In the meanwhile, we're thrilled that we're able to continue to do these things online in a remote format. And who knows, maybe in the future, even when we go back to in-person events, maybe now that we've kind of developed this skill of being good at sharing and broadcasting webinars, maybe we'll even continue with a hybrid approach. Time will tell. And I'm sure there's a lot more ideas and excitement of things to come from that direction. So stay tuned as we continue exploring our new capabilities and new formatting, and continue bringing this type of excellent educational content to you, ISACA South Florida, as well as the South Florida community of those who are interested, whether it's corporate partners or general people who are interested, whether it's students, whether you're members or non-members, whether you're affiliated with another association, you're all very welcome. We're thrilled to have you here with us today as we now get started with this event, which will be Cybersecurity Audits, a conversation from Lynn Roland about cybersecurity audits, what we've learned in a 2020 remote environment. So you've come to the right place, and I'll make right now some very brief general announcements so that I don't take up any considerable amount of time from Lynn, because I myself am also very eager to hear what she has to share with us today. So this session, as advertised, is going to be from now 12 until 1 p.m., give or take, right? We're going to be talking about cybersecurity audits, what we learned in the 2020 remote environment. Right now, you're listening to the very brief introductions from ISACA South Florida and our administrative announcements, which is also my cue and reminder to introduce myself. I'm Rob Valdez. I'm currently serving as chapter president of ISACA South Florida. My information is in the upper right-hand corner, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today to share this excellent thought leadership. Then from approximately 12:05 to, let's say, more or less 12:50, give or take, that's all up to Lynn, of course, will be the presentation, the actual content, so that we can make sure that we leave some time at the end for some question and answer and any kind of wrap up, and we'll show you the additional forthcoming programmatic schedule for ISACA South Florida to make sure that we're keeping you aware of what kind of events are there. I also want to make sure that I mention in the upper right hand corner, you can see that Lynn Cotton, a director of large of ISACA South Florida, has been instrumental in supporting this event, as have a number of people, quite honestly. And Lynn is here supporting us as well today. So thank you very much, Lynn. Of course, you have our domain, our URL, where you can look for further information, isacasouthflorida.org. And real quickly, technical issue, we encourage you to use the Zoom client, as always, for the best possible experience in this webinar. Chrome would be your next best option if you're going to view this in a browser. This is going to be an interactive session, as we're known to do, and that means that there will be the ability for you to ask questions both in that question and answer sort of module that's a part of the Zoom client or the Zoom application. And so you can put in their questions for Lynn so that we can ask them to her at the end of the session. And we'll also have polling. I know that sometimes, occasionally, the polling, for whatever technical reason on your end, may or may not be available to you, but that's why we make that comment at the beginning, that the Zoom client is the best chance that you have of making sure that those are available to you. Chrome is your next best option. So the Q&A will be at the end of the presentation, but of course you can be putting those questions in that Q&A section in the meantime. Technical issues, if you have them, can be sent in the chat, and the ISACA South Florida team will address those questions to the best of our ability. We're not going to belabor Lynn with any of those types of questions. And then, of course, 1 hour of CPE certifications will be sent within 1 week of this event, hopefully sooner, but within 1 week of this event, so that you will receive at the same email that you use to register, you will receive those CPE certificates. So please make sure to sign into Zoom using your real name, the same name that you use to register for events, so that we can reconcile that registration and make sure to get your CPE certificate out to you timely. We deeply appreciate your assistance in that matter, and we want to make sure that we get your very important CPE credits for attending this. So without further ado, I will now take the very quick opportunity to introduce Lynn Roland, who's a partner with RGP. And Lynn is the VP of Risk and Compliance and leads the cybersecurity and data privacy practice at RGP with 25 plus years of experience as an IT security and data privacy GRC strategist. So we're thrilled to have her, and please take it away, Lynn.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to pull this up and put it in presentation mode. And can you hear me okay? All right, great. Thank you, Rob, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being able to join us online today. We have about 10 slides of content, and we'll also, as Rob noted, we have about 3 polling questions. So to begin,
Lynn, I apologize for interrupting. It looks like we're viewing the presenter side of the screen as opposed to the presentation side. And I'm not sure I'm using the right terminology.
Yeah, so that was for the slideshow. Let me go up.
Yeah.
And see if there's another.
Sometimes it's a multi-screen thing, I don't know.
I'm on a multi-screen thing right now. So let me see if I'm not as, it's been a while since we've been in Zoom. We've been using a lot of Teams and Skypes. So let me see if there's a particular tab that you want me to pull up here. Oh.
I get it, and I appreciate you accommodating us. Thank you for that.
Well, right now all I have is the slideshow to choose from down here. So let me stop sharing for a second and see if I can find the presentation mode. You're still seeing?
I don't see the presentation yet, so please share the screen.
Okay. One more time. Sorry, everybody. How's this working?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Let's go forward with it. We appreciate that.
Okay, sorry about that, Rob. All right, so we're going to start off with the work environments pre-COVID and then move into what we saw the impact of the pandemic had on IT departments. Obviously, there were some subsequent changes to the cyber threat landscape, and we want to take a little bit deeper dive into that. And also share what we found across at least 4 specific industry sectors for audit findings and themes that we observed. And then taking all the bullet points above is to share top 10 audit plan considerations for this year. And then we'll wrap it up and see if anybody has any questions that we can field, time permitting. All right, so by the end of 2019, we did see many companies that were continuing to implement remote work arrangements for reasons either because their employees were demanding it or simply because more and more of the operations moved online. Some of the organizations had already adopted a lot of technologies and tools to enable a virtual remote workforce, but of course not everybody was providing it across all sector or all lines of businesses. But what was interesting is we saw a growing trend, and this is underscored again pre-COVID, that 62% of all US workers that were surveyed had some type of telework arrangement, even if it was once a month. But out of that 62%, nearly half said that they were working remote at least once a week. And what I found most interesting in a different survey is that of 2,500 individuals that were polled in the US, 98% they seek some type of remote work arrangement for the remainder of their career. And I think that this is important to underscore because later in the presentation, we sort of come back to this to see what does it look like post pandemic. So the impact now on how this affected a lot of the IT departments. Practically overnight, we saw this huge demand on the networks and the bandwidths and the infrastructures. It just imploded. And I don't know if you all remember, but I was thinking back as I was putting the presentation together, and I do recall the first couple of weeks, if I wasn't having problems getting kicked off of some of the webinars or Skype's meetings that I was on, then I was watching some of my other colleagues. So it was pretty rough start. And that was because we found a lot of the IT departments, they were scrambling to get things into place and they didn't really have that luxury of the time of pulling everybody onto a remote virtual, enabling a largely remote workforce, right? So they had investments, but obviously it was a last minute effort. And if you learned anything, one of the things that we saw among a number of clients was that, especially in a poll that was taken by McKinsey, came out, I think the 5th of October, it showed that companies were forced to expedite whatever transformation strategies that they had around IT and digitizing a lot of their customer and supply chain interactions by a factor of 3 to 4 years. I think the other the things that we saw that were unfolding is that there was a huge pivot that needed to be taken because now some of the cybersecurity strategies that had been put in place really needed to have a bit more scrutiny with priorities around data governance and data protection. And we also saw that that the playing field was becoming quickly uneven. I mean, even the World Health Organization, within a very short period of time of announcing a global pandemic, they themselves reported a 5-fold increase in cyber attacks on their own systems. So I wanted to pause here before we start moving forward and just see how many individuals, how many organizations have already finalized this year's audit plans. And if you're able to, you can pull that up. Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who are able to see that poll, that is there right now. Question 1 is available for you to answer. And it's that question that Lynn just asked. Has your organization already finalized their 2021 audit plans? Because, you know, we're aware that some organizations, many organizations have not. And so we'll leave that open for approximately 60 seconds. And it's been about 30 seconds. And just as a reminder, this works best in the Zoom client, second best in the Chrome browser, because we really want this to be as interactive and an experience as possible, so that Lynn has your perspective, and also so that you can see the perspectives of your peers and colleagues out there as well. So that's been open for approximately 60 seconds now. So I'm going to go ahead and end that poll, and I'm going to share those results so that Lynn, as well as all of you, can see those results.
All right, thank you. This is very interesting. So it looks like we're about it looks like about a third have completed, another third are still working on it, and maybe a quarter are not quite sure how far along that they are. I think what's interesting, and many of you have probably already are very well versed at this, is even if you have solidified your plans, there's always a way to tweak it in a way that slightly broadens the scopes or will enable you to do a deeper dive. And for instance, if we're asked to perform an identity and access management audit, one of the things that we saw as an example of solidified audit plans is to do a deeper dive wherever we come across VPNs. And so that it was just a way to try to get their arms around what was happening real time in the unplanned lockdown and shelter in place that was implemented. So thank you, Rob. You have to stop sharing, and then I can probably move forward.
Yeah, you can close that little browser in the screen now.
I'm not sure if I have access to it the way mine's set up. Is that something that you can do?
Let's see, I closed it on my end. Are you still seeing it over your presentation? If so, you can move it to the side.
Okay, I think I got it now.
Excellent.
All right, Rob, this one's for you. I was getting short on stock photos for the presentation, so I just pulled yours off of LinkedIn. All right, so thank you for that. All right, so cyber criminals clearly have been capitalizing this past year on on what took place. There was some confusion in the very beginning, and as I mentioned, companies were rapidly trying to change and survive and get the right technologies in place to enable a largely virtual remote workplace, right? And so what happened is we saw cyber criminals that really try to apply a full court press on potential victims through phishing attacks and clickbait, and wherever possible, just being very persistent on trying to gain access to credentials. And for the most part, they didn't really have to do anything different. They didn't have to come up with any new clever or innovative ways to bait victims, largely because their targets, their attack surface grew exponentially overnight. And as a result, we had hackers, as seen by the University of Maryland research that showed computers and networks are being attacked every 39 seconds. So with this, we also found a 600% spike in email phishing attacks, which is really the Trojan horse for most of the ransomware attacks that occurred. And we also saw an uptick there. What's really interesting, I find, is that there was also an escalation in threat actors who grew, I think, more brutal with the so-called ransomware as a service offering. So in effect, what we saw were ransomware gangs that became third-party vendors. They were making their money by offering the software that they were developing to their clients, who were the hackers, and actually breaking into the IT systems. So, of course, there were gangs like ransomware gangs like Maze, who during the pandemic indicated that they wouldn't shut down emergency services or healthcare facilities during COVID and a shelter in place. Then there were others like Reich, who targeted healthcare facilities specifically and disseminated TrickBot and Basil Loader through phishing campaigns that either hosted the malware or had an attachment with it. Anyway, it started the cyber chain of infection and ended up on a victim's laptop or desktop. And it really caused a lot of damage, either in the ransomware or data theft, or just the disruption in healthcare services in general. Noteworthy, and I should go back and say noteworthy, is that 1 in 3 companies, according to Tripwire, found that companies were paying the ransom price, either because it was more efficient or it was more cost effective, and it was just a swift solution to a problem or a headache that they didn't have time or they didn't have the money to have a workaround. So in the beginning, it was about 110,000 in the first quarter, but towards the end of the year of 2020, it was upwards of 170,000. So 2020 remote audit theme findings and themes that we observed, I broke it down into 4 industry sectors. And this is a culmination of a number of internal audits that we supported across these 4: hospitality, finance, retail, and healthcare. And I'm just going to share very briefly what some of the findings, like probably 2 for each one, and what we saw as some of the causes. So in the first one, in the hospitality, we saw a lack of control owners who are actually identified for like hardware and software assets and management. And let alone just for being able to assign control owners for remediation and monitoring of those controls. And where newer technologies had been acquired and were on the network and were available, what we found were a lack of documentation or procedures for these newer applications. Very interesting and sometimes concerning. What we found to be mostly the causes of of what we looked at in the hospitality sector with the lack of control owners and lack of documentation is the leisure and travel sector were just, they were hit really hard. And it resulted in workforce reductions that were on the order of double digits. And of course, that would impact the IT departments and IT security operations and budgets. And so as a result, we found historical knowledge that walked out the door, as well as those individuals that would have been accountable for certain controls. So not only was it difficult for them, I mean, it proved very challenging for us as helping internal audit perform these audits, because it would take days, if not weeks, to try to find and reassign somebody who had enough knowledge and enough insight to be able to provide the necessary information. From the financial sector, we found data protection and regulatory compliance, to be the greatest challenge. Some of the lines of businesses, and again, these are just, very brief findings. There were a lack of IT controls that were designed either efficiently, that were the design of them or the operational efficacy of them were failing. Most notably, the effective mitigation of data incidents. So notice I say incidents as opposed to breaches. Some of the lines of business hadn't really taken the time to take a step back for certain types of incidents and understand why they kept reoccurring. And additionally, some types of training prescribed by law had been overlooked. What's interesting about this one is the lack of design and operational effectiveness of these controls. They were stale, they were outdated, maybe the different processes or new technologies or a change in how data was being used. The controls just didn't keep pace. There was also a lack of mapping risk controls to some of the laws and regulations, which which organizations might not be thinking is as important. But as you're looking at mitigating, risk mitigating controls, you also really want to be able to align them with some of the regulations, especially if regulators are knocking on your door. So, and that is an excellent example of the training that, or the lack thereof for role-based positions, where it's actually required by law. It was overlooked. The other thing too that was very interesting in one case was that accountability was so decentralized and so diluted. In other words, there were multiple departments that may have been identified just because of the sheer construct of the organization. There were multiple departments that were responsible for one or more controls, but then with within each department, there were multiple people. So it was just very diluted that at the end of the day, you couldn't really put your finger on even a small group that was accountable for a handful of controls. So what's really unique is that if you look at the first example in hospitality, there was a shortage of IT people. And then if you look at the finance sector example, there were too many people that were associated with controls. I thought that was pretty interesting. From a retail sector perspective, what we found was some of the cases here were that policies and procedures for identity and access management or some type of platform like the use of SailPoint were not really in place, or if the solution was in place, as in one instance, it wasn't fully leveraged. And what we found was that for one of our one of our cybersecurity audits in the retail sector, their growth, especially online, really exploded during COVID-19. So once there was shelter in place and things kind of came to a screeching halt, there was hesitancy to continue to hire much needed IT security folks that had vacancies that they were interviewing. There's boom, hiring freeze. But then in the same context, within weeks, the online business actually boomed, and then they couldn't hire. And when you have a very large remote workforce that was operating for this particular retail client, and you have, it's such a shortage of IT security expertise, you couldn't keep the IT roadmaps moving forward. You couldn't keep a lot of the implementation of applications moving forward. So, what's falling by the wayside too is policies and procedures that are being documented. In the healthcare sector, it's very interesting. We saw, again, this is just a short list, a lack of standards and procedures for periodic review and handling of their third parties, especially vendors that might have access to the IT systems. And I'm not sure that this is actually something new. It seems to be something that organizations tend to struggle with because in the healthcare sector, there are so many third parties that are part of many healthcare organizations' value chain. Everything from trying to secure specialty services, outsource certain functions, back office solutions, you name it. It creates a pretty big pool of third parties and vendors that are being leveraged, and just trying to get your arms around the third party risk management piece of that and having the processes in place so that you can properly vet them, let alone onboard or offboard, and keeping track of vendor access credentials can be pretty overwhelming. Add to that the layer of making sure that for each one of these vendor contracts that you have the proper verbiage and language that's articulating what are the IT security expectations. What are, of course, the data privacy requirements, especially if you're in the state of California and you've got CCPA and CCPA 2.0, known as the Cyber Privacy Rights Act. I mean, in spite of COVID, these regulations continue to press forward and become more stringent. On the lack of effective IT security and data privacy training, what we found in one particular instance is that you can have a really well thought out and robust training initiative or program in place. But what was interesting is that you could, even with the program in place and the training modules that look pretty robust, and training is being executed, it's being delivered, people are taking it, they're getting almost 100% completion. There are amazing metrics, deadlines are met, and all of that is bubbling up to executive management and the board. What's interesting is that it's not very effective because some of the same concerns, some of the training that's delivered, folks do really well on passing the training when they get the questions and surveys, or tested, I should say. But a few weeks later or a few months later, they default back to what they knew before instead of carrying that information forward. Some additional observations outside of those 4 sectors, and some of these we've already mentioned. Remote work policies and procedures or processes were either outdated, or some organizations didn't have them in a rush and they cobbled something together. You know, for lack of a better term, they duct taped it. But these are areas that probably this year should take a greater, organizations should, you know, take a step back, look at what they put together, and it probably needs to be updated. You know, we talk a lot about cybersecurity hygiene, but what does that look like for remote workers? And being able to put together a program that's rolled out that actually states and qualifies what the expectations are if you're a remote worker for how best to button up some of the security expectations on, you know, on the side of the employee. It doesn't all fall solely within the IT department. We also found that, you know, some of the business continuity plans, they looked really good on paper, but maybe they weren't adequately tested. And I mentioned before lack of visibility into the mapping of internal controls to regulations. But also what I found really interesting is after all these years with GDPR, even HIPAA, but especially with CCPA, there's still a lack of good quality, up-to-date data inventories. And I think that the exception to that are organizations that we found that had adopted automated tools and platforms where data mapping was automated and they were able to keep on top of that. However, it would fall short if they didn't have an individual who actually knew how to use the tool. They got all set up by a vendor and everything looked great in the beginning, but by the end of 2020, you know, they were still not updated. And so that created a lot of risk for organizations as well. Rob, I wanted to pause here and wanted to ask a polling question about, in your organization, do you anticipate 50% or more of your current remote employees to remain remote throughout the remainder of 2021?
Excellent. And boy, is this the $1 million question, isn't it? Are 50% or more of us going to, 50% or more of your organization's current remote employees, are they going to remain remote throughout 2021? Question on a lot of people's minds. And of course, that polling question is open now for your responses as we see the responses trickling in. And we're actually, Lynn, we're getting a really fantastic response rate on this question. We're getting about 140, 141 responses already, and it's still going up as we're allowing a little bit of time to pass. Well, again, we'll leave it open 60 seconds so that Lynn can give us some of her thoughts and feedbacks on this. But we got a really good response rate on this, so I'm going to go ahead and end this polling now and share the results with everybody. And so that is that 94 respondents, or approximately 64% of those who responded, said yes, they anticipate 50% or more of the organization's current remote employees will remain remote throughout 2021, right? Some of these things, sometimes when you turn that screw, it doesn't get unturned, right? 15% or 22 respondents said no. 19% or 28 respondents said they're not sure, totally understandable. And then there's a couple of other types of responses in there. So really interesting takeaways from that 64% Lynn think they'll remain, at least 50% will remain remote.
Right. And, you know, I wonder how much of that is because the business model has changed. And like you said, they got a taste of it. And so it works, right? Business, business as usual is different than what it looked like a year or two ago, but it's still working. Or is this, a commitment through the end of 2021 simply because they want to ensure that the vaccine is rolled out, and for those who want to get it, that those that gets that option is put in place and folks can take advantage of it, and or that travel restrictions are anticipated to continue well into 2021, right? So a lot of unknowns at this point, but this is good to know because this is the kind of insight that you want and integrate it in this year's audit planning so that you can make sure that you have the appropriate controls that are in place, and moreover, just to understand better the efficacy of them. So let me go to here. So I do want to get into the 2021 audit plan considerations, and I have 10. But there's two areas I'd like to cover first. And one of them I mentioned earlier, which was to see how the remote work environment has changed now a year after COVID hit the United States. But first, I would be remiss if I didn't at least take a moment to talk about SolarWinds and what happened there. I'd like to presume everybody on this call knows all the details of what happened with the hack back in December, because you just have that much time on your hands in between the holidays and work. But for those who don't, I wanted to give some of the salient points, but also be able to integrate that in our discussion today. So to begin, I'm not going to do a deep dive, but it's probably the worst cyber assault on our government than we've ever seen. And the OPM breach was pretty bad because I was one of those people that had a TSSCI credentials for the federal government. So there was a lot of very, very sensitive information that was compromised. But for SolarWinds, I'll give the cliff notes. It was discovered in December that sometime back in March 2020, a cyber attack by a nation state believed to be the Russian intelligence agency, I guess they're also known as Cozy Bear, penetrated multiple parts of our federal government to gain access both to state secrets, trade secrets, intellectual property, strategies, probably military, personal data. We'll continue to learn for weeks and months exactly what all they had access to. But what happened was a supply chain attack on the Texas-based company that's a provider of network monitoring software, SolarWinds, released an update in one of their software, Orion, which is used pervasively throughout the federal agencies and probably thousands of industry organizations. The hackers inserted a malicious code into the Orion update, and but it wasn't just Orion that was affected. Microsoft Cloud Services that was used, and VMware products were also ways in which attackers could reach victims. And it allowed them access to emails and other documents, and they were able to perform federated authentication across victim resources, either by way of a single sign-on infrastructure, potentially. So, we know it's probably the worst cyber espionage incident to hit us, and the fact that they had 8 to 9 months crawling around through the federal agencies before we were able to, to notice it just makes it even worse. But, some of the agencies that were affected, Pentagon, Energy, State Department, NIH, Commerce, Department of Homeland Security, treasury. I mean, the list goes on. And I think it was probably as of December, SolarWinds had somewhere on the order, I heard, of like 300,000 customers. And I think just about nearly all of that fell on the Fortune 500 list. So anybody feel free to correct me if that's wrong. So the severity of the cybersecurity landscape obviously is escalated, and for these reasons. Again, University of Maryland, noted that every 39 seconds there's a network attack. We had a global pandemic that's caused a seismic shift in how we deliver products and services, and then of course it resulted in shelter in place, reshaping our work environments to mostly virtual workforce. And now the discovery of the largest state-sponsored cyber attack on the United States, affecting our critical infrastructure. We're just not quite sure how and to what extent in our federal departments. Those are the trends and events that I think are influencing what businesses decide to include in their audit plans. Clearly, there are other things aside from this that are drivers that have, that have helped to shape what your individual audit plans are this year. But I think evaluating an organization's readiness to any of these bullet points, to the developments and testing their effective management of the impact from these disruptors would be pretty key. The second one that I mentioned that I wanted to circle back on is, what does the business environment look like now after probably 9 months of working remote? What we found is that nearly 70%, and there's two of the same surveys now this year that I leveraged at the beginning of this presentation, but nearly 70% of US employees are working from home full-time. 75% state that they're equally or more productive. And they're saving probably anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half on average for round trip commuting. So maybe that's one reason. And 80% expect to work from home at least 3 days a week in 2020. 25% of the respondents report that they're working more hours. And that might not come to a surprise for most of you who are on this call. Looking around at myself, my colleagues, and even the client environments, they are longer hours. And it's really tough to be able to determine where does work end and when does, the balance of life and family begin. What's interesting, I think, are two key bullet points that are on here. One is, it's not surprising that employees are probably saving $480 a month from not having to go into the office. But moreover, is that for every employee that's working full-time remote each year, businesses stand to gain on average about $11,000 in savings. I think that's big, but probably bigger to me is this recent report that came out at the end of December that 1 in 2 employees report, we're not sure if they're going to do it, but at least this is what they said, is they don't plan to return to a job if it doesn't offer remote work options. And we saw that most of them want to work at least 1 day a week, and they want to be able to do that for the remainder of their careers. So I think this plays into not just 2021 audit plans, but just looking outward, how will this impact a number of considerations within an organization? But obviously, I think internal audit planning would want to take a closer scrutiny on what the impacts are and being able to evaluate the efficacy of this being operationalized. So from an audit plan perspective, and this is just rolling up, it's a culmination of everything that we just discussed. We would think that you would look at physical and logical access controls as well as your hardware and software asset inventories with a bit more scrutiny. Data inventory management seems to make the list every year. We recommend the mapping of controls to regulatory mandates where and if it makes sense for you, but especially around what we see for CCPA, CPRAs. I remember the California Consumer Privacy Act, and then the referendum that passed in November, which makes it more stringent, the California Privacy Rights Act, GDPR, and HIPAA audits. Third-party risk management, that I think tends to be something that's high on everybody's list. Patch management, stress testing your business continuity plans, training and more training, just making sure that individuals are getting the right training for their roles and responsibilities, that training does align to what regulations are mandating, and that training design and delivery is having the impact and efficacy that organizations are looking for. Obviously, adequate staffing. One of the things that was pretty prevalent where there was a shortage of IT staff was a lack of segregation of duties. But that's kind of adding insult to injury, because if you're already trying to do more with a shortage of IT staff, then that's segregation of duties tends to get a little bit more challenging. The last one that I want to mention is this, what we're seeing more of. It's not new, it's been around for probably at least 4 or 5 years that I'm aware of, is the idea of evaluating risk culture. And what we mean by risk culture is, well, it's defined more or less of a construct of values and behaviors that are present day to day throughout an organization that helps shape decisions about risk. And we're starting to see more of the ask that once an audit has been completed, the planning, the field work, and now you're into drafting the report, that they would like to have an evaluation or an assessment of the organization's risk culture. And that would typically come about through the process of interacting with stakeholders throughout that exercise. And I think it's really important because, what you're trying to get is that third-party view of are stakeholders anticipating risk? Are they, recognizing risk when it's brought to them and dealing with it head on, saying, okay, yes, it's a risk, doesn't matter how bad it is. We're going to identify it, we're going to treat it, and we're going to, deal with that head on. There are some risks, obviously, you say, well, we're willing to absorb that. You document why, and you tend to have some consensus on it. But this is different in the sense of, does an organization's culture breed good risk decision-making habits? So anyway, these are the top 10. I don't think that they're probably a surprise to anybody, but what's nice is that serendipitously, they do align, most of them, to Gartner's report that they issued just last month. They do it annually, Audit Plan Hotspots. And this is what they teed up as the 2021 Audit Plan Hotspots. IT governance, third parties there, business continuity, talent resilience, and making the list was risk culture and decision making. So this is our third and final polling question. How many of you have begun to integrate a risk culture across your first line of defense? Just the first line of defense. If it's more, that's great. And just to recap, risk culture, the construct of values and behaviors present throughout an organization that shape day-to-day risk decisions.
Excellent. And that polling question is live now. The responses are coming in. It's been live for about 23 seconds, and we'll give it another few seconds as we're gathering those responses. We already have, actually, this is a great question because people are very interested in it. We already have 139 responses, so already a fantastic response rate to the question. Has your organization begun to integrate or already has in place a risk culture across your first line of defense? Fantastic question, and it's been open for about 55 seconds. So go ahead and respond if you're able and willing, and I'll close that now and share with everybody so that we can all see that 66% of respondents are saying yes, they've already begun to integrate a risk culture across the first line of defense. 11% still saying no, not yet. 22% saying not sure, and then there's very small amount of responses that are other. So headed in the right direction for sure, Lynn.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you know, it would be interesting for those who are actually integrated it into their internal audit plans, or just as part of their day-to-day processes for internal audit. It would be very interesting to know, just maybe in the comment section, if you two have tried to include a risk culture assessment as part of one or more of your assessments or audits in 2020. That would be very interesting to know. Thanks. Okay. Moving on. So we're just going to wrap up for a bit here, and I'll summarize some of the salient points that we've stepped through, and maybe some of you will have some questions. You know, when possible, including in the audit plans that reflect this new landscape of vulnerabilities and threats and risks that we've been seeing trending either prior to COVID or as a result of COVID, or even just in recent weeks. Understanding, you know, where a rapid response ensued in your organization to enable the work from home capabilities, just scrutinizing the user privileges and access controls. I'm sure that that's already done. This is probably not, you know, something that is overlooked by many organizations, but I think making sure that the new technologies that, you know, are aligning to IT governance plans and roadmap strategies, that would be useful. Reviewing the third-party agreements and contractual language, and ensuring that the IT security expectations are really clearly defined. I can't tell you how many samplings that we had of vendor contracts and agreements that didn't really have it spelled out. Was surprising. And establishing a process for monitoring the vendor compliance. It doesn't have to be like a GDPR where you have to get in and Article 28 says you have to be auditing them, but there's got to be a way to have an established process for evaluating, monitoring, onboarding, and offboarding vendors. And I think taking a closer look at that would be very helpful, especially in light of some of these new laws that you know, are looking to see that organizations are doing that. Training initiatives. I mentioned that at least twice. I think making sure again that where it's mandated by regulations that specific roles have certain types of training, that the right people are getting the necessary training. Again, mentioned determining how well an organization is mapping its controls, not only to risk, but also to regulatory and legal mandates, because more and more being able to demonstrate your due diligence isn't just by the activities or by the documentation, but it's showing full circle that where there is a control to mitigate risk, that it also is aligned where appropriate and where you can to the regulatory and legal mandates. And finally, consider how employees are going to be reporting to work after lockdowns have been lifted, and maybe travel, begins to break loose a little bit more. And again, I see the rollout of the option for vaccinations to help with that, might be a key driver. But looking at how things might not revert back to 2019 and what you need to have in place in order to be successful, and any lessons learned from 2020. I know that there were quite a few that we found as a result of shelter in place, but I think these are the high points going into finalizing audit plans for 2021. And this pretty much concludes some of the points that some of the observations and findings that we had over the last 6 to 9 months. I hope you found it useful. And I want to turn it back over to Rob and thank him for inviting me to share our insights today. And hopefully we can have some time for some Q&A.
Wonderful, Lynn. Thank you so much. What a fantastic presentation, and some really excellent points brought up, and a lot to think about for everybody. So I'm going to, while we do the Q&A, I'm going to real quick share the forward-looking schedule. I want to be mindful of people's time, so maybe we'll just get to one question as we're kind of wrapping this up. And there's actually a ton of comments. Fantastic presentation, Lynn. You've really started a lot of conversations that we could continue for quite some time. But I know that a lot of people are saying that they're starting to integrate risk culture into their actual audits and starting to include those type of things. And I know that was a big point for Richard Chambers as well from the IIA. So I wanted to actually maybe, as we're kind of wrapping up, you could sort of expand on how RGP is approaching integrating auditing risk culture for those people who are still trying to get that going.
Sure. So there we go. Let me move this out of the way here. So in terms of what we've been asked to do and integrating it in our internal audits that we provide for clients, is that your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah. So what our clients are asking, and how we've integrated it, is to look at, and I'll give you an example. We look at how free and the environment of sharing risk and being able to challenge risk when it's brought up. For instance, in one particular case, we were going through and sharing audit findings and observations as we were rounding out the audit, and we might have had like 12 people in the call. And there was really only one person speaking. And what we found was that how this one person responded really set the tone for everybody else and for the organization. It wasn't at the top, it wasn't a CEO. It was within the information technology organization, of course, and there wasn't any challenge. There wasn't any dialogue or discussion. And so those are the things that we look for within, an assessment of an organization's risk culture. we look to see that there is not only an opportunity for an open dialogue, but just how well individuals are anticipating risk as well. We don't get so much into the risk treatment, although that's part of it. It really comes down to the stakeholders and the discussions that we've been part of to see how well they are managing and really keeping an open mind about how they are doing things and what is the process for them for making risk-based decisions. So it ends up being about an extra 2 or 3 slides or an extra page or 2 within a report that's identifying what does work, what is working, what are some of the practices that they're performing that's enabling a positive and a good risk culture. And, you know, it's going to, you know, what does good look like? That answer is going to be different for each organization.
Very, very good point, right? Yeah, and we look forward to continuing to integrate these types of things into our control environments, all of us, in the future going forward. Once again, thank you so much, Lynn. Fantastic presentation. I feel like honestly we could discuss this for another hour, but I know that everybody has a busy schedule. Speaking of which, and being mindful of all those video conferences that we're all doing all day, right? So I'll just take a very brief second to point out that here's our future schedule. Lots of events coming up for ISACA South Florida, including a question and answer session with the general who was with us last fall, and that is the general who was formerly overseeing all of cybersecurity for the entire Air Force and now works for FireEye. So I'm sure you can imagine he has some thoughts as well on the topic that Lynn brought up, which is the SolarWinds breach and the subsequent impact also. And then chapter nominations will be available so that people could join the board if they're interested and willing to do so for the elections that will start in April. And then our WOW conference will be a week long of lunch and learn sessions that will go from February 15th to February 19th. So we look forward to exploring the virtual version of the WOW conference this year. And as you can see, plenty of other things forthcoming from ISACA South Florida. So I hope you will all join me in thanking very much Lynn for participating with us today in a fantastic presentation. Please feel free to reach out to us in any of us at our website and at these email addresses for any additional questions. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you so much, Lynn.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you.